Wait! The word echoed through the courtroom, stopping everything. The judge's gavel froze in the air. Lawyers stopped talking. Even the people sitting in the audience held their breath. At the back of the courtroom stood a small boy, no older than 12. His clothes were torn, his hands were shaking, and his eyes were filled with fear. "Please, Your Honor, don't decide yet." People began whispering around the room. "That's the boy who stole bread. A thief!" Suddenly, the angry store owner stood up. "Yes, Your Honor, that boy stole from my shop." But the boy didn't run. He didn't deny it either. Instead, he slowly walked forward, holding a crumpled hospital paper tightly in his hand. "Yes, I took the bread." The entire courtroom gasped, but then the boy said something that made the room fall into complete silence. "My little sister hasn't eaten for 2 days." Even the judge looked stunned. But what happened next shocked everyone in the room. When the judge read the hospital paper and heard the boy's story, his face suddenly turned pale, because the sick woman the boy was trying to save was the same woman who once saved the judge's life. And in that moment, the courtroom realized they weren't looking at a criminal. They were looking at a hero. Stay with this story until the end, because what the judge does next will leave the entire courtroom in tears. Welcome to Heroic Stories Hub, the place where powerful stories of courage, kindness, and unexpected heroes come to life. Here, every story will touch your heart, surprise your mind, and remind you that even the smallest act of kindness can change someone's life forever. If you love emotional stories with powerful lessons, make sure you watch until the end, because the best part of the story is always the moment that changes everything. "Wait!" The word exploded through the courtroom like a sudden crack of thunder. "Please, Your Honor, wait!" The courtroom froze instantly. The judge's gavel stopped mid-air, only inches above the wooden desk. The lawyers stopped shuffling their papers. Even the quiet murmurs from the audience vanished. Every head slowly turned toward the back of the courtroom. There, standing nervously between 2 rows of benches, was a small boy. He looked no older than 12. His clothes were old and faded. His shirt was too big for him, hanging loosely from his thin shoulders. His shoes were torn at the front, revealing the tips of his socks. But what people noticed most was his face. His eyes were red and swollen, as if he hadn't slept or been crying for hours, and now he was shaking. The courtroom guard immediately stepped forward. "You cannot interrupt the court. Sit down immediately." But the boy didn't sit. Instead, he stepped forward slowly, clutching a folded piece of paper tightly in his hand. "Please, I just need 1 minute." The guard reached out to stop him, but the judge raised a hand. "Let him speak." The guard stepped back reluctantly. A quiet wave of whispers moved through the courtroom. "That's the boy. Yes, the one from the grocery store. The thief." The word spread through the room like poison. Thief. The boy heard it. His shoulders lowered slightly, as if the word itself weighed heavily on him. Near the front row sat a large man with a thick mustache and an expensive suit. He leaned forward with an irritated expression. "That boy stole from my store." His voice echoed through the room. "He walked in yesterday and ran out with a loaf of bread like a criminal." The boy lowered his head, but he didn't argue. The judge finally spoke again. "Bring the boy forward." The guard guided him slowly toward the front. As he walked, people stared at him, some with anger, some with curiosity, and a few with pity. When he finally stood in front of the judge's desk, he looked even smaller. The judge studied him carefully. "What is your name, son?" "Daniel. Daniel Collins. How old are you, Daniel? 12, sir. The judge nodded slowly. You interrupted the court during a verdict. That is very serious. Daniel nodded quickly. I know, I'm sorry. His fingers tightened around the folded paper. But I had to speak before you decide. The judge raised an eyebrow. Why? Daniel took a shaky breath. Because everyone thinks they know what happened. The store owner scoffed loudly. We do know what happened. He pointed at Daniel. You stole from my store. A few people in the audience nodded. Yes, we saw the report, caught on camera. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes, I took the bread. The courtroom stirred with murmurs again. There it is. He admitted it. Unbelievable. The store owner leaned back with a smug expression. See? Case closed. But Daniel suddenly lifted his head. But I didn't steal it for me. The words caused a ripple of surprise. The judge leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? Daniel's lips trembled. His eyes filled with tears he tried desperately to hold back. I took the bread because my little sister was hungry. The room fell quieter. Daniel continued speaking. She hasn't eaten properly in 2 days. A woman sitting near the back gasped softly, but the store owner quickly crossed his arms. That's not my problem. Daniel flinched slightly at the words, but he kept speaking. I went to the store yesterday afternoon. I didn't go there to steal. He wiped his eyes with his sleeve. I asked if I could take the bread and pay later. He slowly turned his head toward the store owner, but he said no. The man shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Daniel continued, I tried to explain about my sister, but he told me to leave. The courtroom remained silent. Daniel looked down at his torn shoes. My sister was crying when I left home. His voice broke slightly. She kept saying she was hungry. I didn't know what else to do. The judge watched him carefully. So you went back to the store? Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. He paused. I waited until nobody was looking. The audience leaned forward. And then I took the bread and ran. The store owner slammed his hand on the desk again. Exactly. He confessed. Daniel looked down again. Yes, I did. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Daniel slowly raised the folded paper in his shaking hand. But that's not the whole story. The judge glanced at the paper. What is that? Daniel took a deep breath. This is from the hospital. The courtroom grew quieter again. My mother is sick. The judge gestured for the guard to bring the paper, but Daniel spoke again before handing it over. Everyone thinks I'm just a thief. His voice trembled again. But nobody asked why I needed that bread. The guard handed the paper to the judge. The judge slowly unfolded it. Daniel continued speaking softly. My mother has been in the hospital for 2 weeks. We used the last of our money on her medicine. My little sister and we've been trying to survive alone. Some people in the audience exchanged uneasy looks. Daniel wiped his eyes again. I wasn't trying to run away forever. I just needed 1 day. The judge began reading the hospital paper carefully. Then Daniel added something that made the room completely still. I was going to pay for the bread today. The store owner frowned. With what money? Daniel slowly reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small, old watch with a cracked leather strap. This was my father's. Gasps spread quietly through the courtroom. I was going to sell it this morning. He held it tightly. It's the only thing he left us. His voice dropped to a whisper. But my sister needed food more. The judge looked up from the hospital paper. His expression had changed completely. Daniel swallowed nervously. I know stealing is wrong. I know I broke the law. Tears rolled down his cheeks. "But I swear I wasn't trying to be a criminal." The courtroom remained silent. Daniel's voice shook again as he spoke his final words. "I was just trying to be a brother." And as the judge looked back down at the hospital document in his hands, something written on that paper made his eyes suddenly widen. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but in just a few seconds, everything in that room was about to change. The courtroom was completely silent. Not a single chair moved. Not a single whisper floated through the room. Everyone's eyes were fixed on the judge. He was staring at the hospital document Daniel had handed him. His eyebrows slowly tightened as he read each line. Meanwhile, Daniel stood quietly in front of the desk, his small hands shaking. He kept glancing at the floor, too afraid to look at the people staring at him. Finally, the judge spoke. "Daniel, where did you get this paper?" Daniel swallowed nervously. "The hospital gave it to me yesterday." The judge looked back down at the document again. "And your mother is currently admitted there?" "Yes, sir." Daniel's fingers twisted together anxiously. "She's been there for 2 weeks." The judge slowly folded the paper and placed it on the desk. "And there is no one else helping you?" Daniel shook his head. "No, it's just me and my little sister." A quiet murmur spread through the courtroom. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Tell the court everything that happened." Daniel nodded slowly. He took a deep breath, trying to control the shaking in his voice. "We used to have a normal life." The courtroom listened carefully. "My dad worked at a factory outside the city." Daniel's eyes looked distant, as if he were replaying old memories. "He worked very hard." A faint sadness filled his voice. "Every Friday he brought sweets for me and my sister." For a moment, Daniel almost smiled, but the smile faded quickly. Then one day, everything changed. He looked down again. The factory closed. People in the courtroom exchanged sympathetic glances. My dad tried to find another job, but no one was hiring. Daniel's voice trembled. Months passed. We started running out of money. The store owner shifted slightly in his seat. Daniel continued. My mom started working 2 jobs. She worked during the day at a clinic and cleaned offices at night. The courtroom remained silent. She barely slept. Daniel's hands tightened. But she always told us everything would be okay. He took a shaky breath. Then one night, my father didn't come home. A woman in the audience gasped softly. Daniel's voice dropped lower. We waited all night, but he never came back. A heavy silence filled the room. The judge listened without interrupting. Daniel continued. The next morning, my mom went looking for him, but nobody had seen him. Days passed, then weeks. He never returned. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. My mom stopped smiling after that. A woman in the audience wiped her eyes. Daniel looked down again, but she kept working. He paused for a moment before continuing. Then, a few months ago, she started getting very sick. The judge leaned forward. What kind of illness? Daniel shook his head. I don't understand the medical words, but the doctor said she needed treatment quickly. He looked toward the hospital document. That paper explains everything. The judge glanced at it again. Daniel continued. At first, my mom tried to hide it. She kept saying it was just a cold. But one night, she fainted while making dinner. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. I called an ambulance. They took her to the hospital. Daniel's breathing grew heavier. The doctor told me she needed medicine and special treatment. His voice dropped to a whisper. But it costs more money than we have. The courtroom remained silent. Daniel wiped his eyes again. We used the last of our savings. But it still wasn't enough. The store owner slowly uncrossed his arms. Daniel continued. My sister and I started staying home alone. I tried to cook for her. But sometimes there was nothing left in the kitchen. A man in the audience shook his head sadly. Daniel's voice trembled again. Yesterday morning, my sister fainted. The courtroom gasped again. She was so hungry. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment. When she woke up, she whispered something to me. The judge watched him carefully. What did she say? Daniel's lips trembled. She said, Daniel, I'm not hungry anymore. Just let Mom eat when she comes home. Several people in the courtroom wiped tears from their faces. Daniel continued. That's when I decided to go to the store. I thought maybe someone would help. He looked toward the store owner again. I asked politely if I could take bread and pay later. The store owner lowered his eyes slightly. But he refused. Daniel continued. I didn't blame him. He has a business. But when I left the store, Daniel's voice broke again. I kept hearing my sister crying in my head. His hands trembled. So I went back. I waited until nobody was looking. And then I grabbed the bread. The courtroom remained silent. I ran out, but I wasn't planning to run away forever. Daniel reached into his pocket again and held up the old watch. I planned to sell this today. He stared at the watch carefully. My dad gave it to me before he disappeared. He told me to keep it safe. Daniel's voice cracked again. But my sister needed food more than memories. The room was completely silent. Then Daniel looked directly at the judge. I know I broke the law. I know I deserve punishment. Tears rolled down his cheeks again. But please understand, I didn't steal because I'm a bad person. I stole because I was scared. The judge slowly picked up the hospital paper again. Daniel added one last sentence. And if my mom doesn't get treatment soon, he paused. The words were hard to say. Then he forced himself to finish. She might not survive. The courtroom fell into deep, painful silence. Even the store owner now looked uneasy. But as the judge read one specific line on the hospital paper, his expression suddenly changed. His eyes widened slightly, and for a brief moment, the judge completely froze. The judge stared at the hospital document in complete silence. His eyes moved slowly across the page again and again, as if he could not believe what he was reading. His hand tightened slightly around the paper. The courtroom waited. Something about the judge's expression had changed. His calm, professional face now looked stunned. Finally, he spoke. Daniel. His voice was quieter than before. Daniel looked up nervously. Yes, sir. The judge slowly removed his glasses and placed them on the desk. For a moment, he didn't speak. The courtroom could feel the tension growing. Then the judge asked a question. What did you say your mother's name was? Daniel wiped his eyes. Maria Collins. The judge froze. The paper slipped slightly in his hand. Maria Collins? Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." A strange silence filled the courtroom. The judge leaned back in his chair, staring at Daniel with a look no one expected. Not anger, not disappointment, something deeper, something emotional. "How old did you say you are?" the judge asked again. 12. The judge's eyes slowly filled with emotion. For a moment, it looked like he was remembering something very far away. Then he whispered something almost to himself. "It can't be." The courtroom leaned forward. Even the store owner looked confused now. Finally, the judge looked directly at Daniel. "Daniel, what hospital is your mother in?" "St. Mary's Hospital, sir." The judge nodded slowly. His hands were still slightly shaking. Then he said something that made the entire courtroom fall into stunned silence. "Your mother once saved my life." Gasps echoed across the room. Daniel blinked in confusion. "What?" The judge leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk. "Years ago, before I became a judge, I was in a terrible car accident." His voice carried a deep memory. "My car slid off a wet road during a storm. The doctors said my injuries were severe." He paused. "The hospital was overcrowded that night." He paused. "But one nurse refused to give up on me." The judge looked down at the hospital paper again. Her name was Maria Collins. A wave of shocked whispers spread across the courtroom. Daniel's eyes widened. "My mom?" The judge nodded. "Yes. She stayed beside my hospital bed the entire night." He paused. "She monitored every heartbeat, every breath." His voice grew emotional. "When the doctors said my chances were low, she told them to keep trying." He looked at Daniel again. "She even stayed past her shift. No one asked her to, but she refused to leave." The courtroom was completely silent now. The judge continued. "At one point, I actually lost consciousness." He paused. "The doctors almost gave up." He paused. "But your mother didn't." The judge's voice trembled slightly. She kept repeating something I will never forget. Daniel listened carefully. The judge spoke slowly. She said, "No life is worthless. Everyone deserves a second chance." A heavy silence filled the courtroom. Daniel's eyes filled with tears again. The judge leaned forward slightly. "Those words stayed with me for years." He gestured toward Daniel gently. "And today, you reminded me of those exact words." The store owner suddenly stood up from his chair. "Your Honor, I didn't know the boy's situation." He looked at Daniel. "If I had known—" His voice faded. The judge raised his hand calmly. "The court understands." Then he turned back to Daniel. "Daniel Collins." Daniel stood very still. His hands trembled slightly. "Yes, sir?" The judge lifted his gavel slowly. "You admitted to taking bread without paying." Daniel nodded quietly. "Yes. But the law must also consider intent." The judge looked directly into Daniel's eyes. "You were not acting out of greed." He raised his voice slightly. "You were acting out of desperation." The courtroom remained silent. Then the judge spoke firmly. "This court does not see a criminal standing before us today." Daniel's eyes widened. The judge continued, "We see a brave young boy trying to protect his family." The gavel came down. "Therefore, all charges against Daniel Collins are dismissed." For a moment, the courtroom was silent. Then, quiet applause began. Some people even wiped tears from their eyes. Daniel stood frozen. You mean I'm not going to jail?" The judge gave a small smile. "No, Daniel. You are going home." Tears rolled down Daniel's cheeks. "Thank you, sir." But the judge wasn't finished. He stood up from his chair. "There is one more matter." The courtroom fell silent again. The judge turned toward the courtroom audience. "This court cannot ignore a family in need." He looked at the clerk beside him. "Contact St. Mary's Hospital immediately." The clerk nodded quickly. The judge continued, "The court will cover Maria Collins' medical expenses." Gasps filled the room. Daniel looked stunned. "Really?" The judge nodded. "Yes, because years ago your mother refused to let me die." His voice softened. "And today I refuse to let her suffer alone." Daniel suddenly burst into tears. Thank you so much." The judge stepped down from his bench and walked closer to him. He gently placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "You did something very brave today." Daniel sniffed quietly. "I was just trying to help my sister." The judge smiled warmly. "That's what heroes do." The courtroom remained quiet as everyone watched the moment. Then the judge spoke one final time. "Remember this, everyone. Sometimes the people we call criminals are simply people who needed help." He looked toward Daniel again. "And sometimes kindness returns when we least expect it." Daniel nodded slowly, still wiping tears from his face. That day, the courtroom learned something powerful. A single act of kindness can travel through time, and one day it might come back to save a life.